Sophie Grant had always prided herself on being a survivor. Life had thrown many challenges her way, but she had faced them head-on. The weight of her grief, however, was something different. It had been 5 years since Mark's death in that tragic boating accident, 5 years since her world had shattered. Sophie could still recall the cold, empty feeling that had consumed her the moment she'd received the news. Mark's body had never been recovered, and that uncertainty had eaten at her every day. There had been no closure, no chance to say goodbye. Her daughter, Lily, was only 6 years old at the time, and Sophie had promised herself she would never let her see her mother crumble. They had learned to live without Mark, but the hole he left behind never truly healed. Now, Sophie's life had settled into a routine. Work at the diner, time with Lily, and the rare moments when she allowed herself to remember what it felt like to laugh and love. Today was no different. She bustled around the diner, serving customers with a tired smile, her movements automatic. The evening rush was in full swing when her boss, Steve, approached her with an unexpected offer. "Sophie, I got a special catering gig," Steve said, pulling her aside. "A wedding at Willowbrook Country Club. They need extra hands. Pays double what you usually make." Sophie blinked, surprised by the offer. It wasn't that she needed the money. She had managed to scrape by. But something about the idea of leaving the familiar rhythm of the diner for something more glamorous appealed to her. It felt like a break from the monotony. Maybe even a chance to escape her thoughts, if only for a few hours. "I'll take it," she said, before she could second-guess herself. When Sophie arrived at Willowbrook, she was stunned by the elegance of it all. The grand ballroom was filled with sparkling chandeliers, delicate floral arrangements, and crystal glasses catching the soft, golden light. She had seen venues like this only in magazines, never in real life. The guests were all dressed in formal attire, their laughter and conversations filling the air. It was a far cry from the greasy diner she called home. Sophie was assigned to the kitchen staff, where she helped prepare the hors d'oeuvres and serve drinks. It was fast-paced but exhilarating. The atmosphere, however, felt too polished, too perfect, and Sophie found herself longing for the comfort of her simple life. As the night went on, her mind began to wander, thoughts of Mark creeping in, as they always did. Then, as she was carrying a tray of champagne flutes, Sophie's eyes landed on the groom. Her heart stopped. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. There was no mistaking the face. She could never forget those sharp blue eyes, the way his smile had always been both comforting and mischievous. Mark. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be him. She shook her head, her thoughts racing. It was impossible. He was dead. She'd mourned him, buried him, and moved on. But there he was, standing at the altar, looking every bit the man she had loved, every bit the man who had disappeared 5 years ago without a trace. Her legs felt weak, and the tray slipped from her hands, clattering to the floor. The noise snapped her out of her daze. She was surrounded by guests who were now staring at her, and in that moment, Sophie felt as though the entire world was watching. Her breath became shallow, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had to leave. Without thinking, Sophie turned and fled, running through the kitchen and out the back door into the cool evening air. Her mind was spinning, her thoughts a jumbled mess of confusion and disbelief. She barely noticed the man who stepped into her path as she rushed outside. "Hey, are you okay?" A voice called, concern in his tone. Sophie stopped short, almost colliding with him. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his dark hair slightly tousled. His eyes, kind and understanding, locked onto hers. He must have seen the panic in her face because he immediately reached out a hand to steady her. Sophie swallowed, unable to find the words. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her mind still reeling from the shock of seeing Mark. "I need to get out of here," she whispered. "Of course," the man said gently. "I'm Benjamin." He offered a reassuring smile. "Do you need a place to sit, a place to think?" Sophie hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, please." Benjamin led her to a small, quiet bench at the far end of the property, away from the wedding festivities. He sat beside her, not saying anything, but his presence was enough. Sophie's breathing slowed as she stared at her hands, unsure of how to process what she had just seen. Her mind was still in a haze, trying to make sense of the impossible. Benjamin spoke softly after a long pause. "It's okay to be upset. Do you want to talk about it?" Sophie shook her head. The words she wanted to say were stuck in her throat. She wasn't even sure what she was feeling. But the truth was, deep down, she knew she couldn't keep running from this. Whatever was happening, she needed answers. I think I need to go home," she said, her voice trembling. Benjamin didn't press her further. He simply nodded and stood, offering her a hand. Sophie took it, grateful for his quiet support. As they walked back toward the parking lot, she couldn't shake the image of Mark from her mind. She had to confront this, even if she wasn't ready. The drive back home was a blur for Sophie. The streets passed by in a haze, and her thoughts were consumed by the same question. What was Mark doing at that wedding? She hadn't even noticed when Benjamin had offered to drive her home, but now that she was alone in her car, the silence was deafening. When she arrived, Lily was already in bed, her small form tucked under the covers, oblivious to the storm raging inside her mother. Sophie lingered at the door of Lily's room for a long moment, watching her daughter sleep. How could she tell her that the man who had died all those years ago had just reappeared? How could she explain what that would mean for their lives? Sophie needed to talk to someone. But who? There was no one she could turn to. Not in this. Her friends would never understand, and her family, they'd all thought Mark was gone. His reappearance was as impossible as it was devastating. The next morning, Sophie woke early, determined to find out the truth. She tried calling the Willowbrook Country Club, but they were no help. Then she turned to the only person she could think of, Clara. Clara had worked with Mark at his company, and maybe, just maybe, she had answers. It took several calls before Clara finally answered, her voice hesitant but willing. "I know you must be confused," Clara said when Sophie explained what had happened, "but there's a lot you don't know. Mark's disappearance wasn't an accident. He was in danger, and he had to go underground." Sophie's heart raced as Clara's words sank in. Danger? Underground? What was going on? "I'll tell you everything I can," Clara continued, "but we need to meet. It's too risky to talk on the phone." Sophie agreed, her mind already racing with questions. She had to know why Mark had left, what had really happened. But as she hung up the phone, one truth began to settle in her heart. The life she thought she had built for Lily and herself might never be the same again. The day after her unsettling encounter at Willowbrook, Sophie felt as though her entire world had tilted off its axis. Mark's sudden appearance, his reappearance at the wedding, felt like a cruel joke played by fate, one that she wasn't prepared to understand. She spent the morning pacing her small living room, trying to make sense of everything, but all the questions felt like knots in her stomach. Why hadn't he contacted her? Why hadn't he tried to reach out to their daughter, Lily? Was it really him? Sophie had never been good at letting things go. When something unsettled her, she clung to it like a lifeline. The thought of Mark, alive and well, sent waves of anger and hurt through her. She had spent so many years believing in his death, mourning him in her own quiet way, only to have the rug pulled out from under her like this. Lily had woken up asking for breakfast, unaware of the storm swirling in her mother's heart. Sophie did her best to keep things normal for her daughter, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to hide the turmoil inside. As she watched Lily eat her cereal, Sophie forced a smile. She couldn't let this shake her daughter's world. Lily had already lost too much. Sophie would protect her from this new, chaotic truth. But how could she protect her from something she didn't understand herself? The phone rang, breaking the silence in the room. It was Clara. "I'm glad you called me," Clara said, her voice soft but urgent. "I know you must be confused, but there's a lot to explain. We need to meet. There's information I have that I can't tell you over the phone." Sophie's heart pounded as Clara's words echoed in her ears. This was it, the moment she would finally get answers. She couldn't let this slip away. "I'll meet you," Sophie said, her voice steady, though her mind was racing. "Where?" Clara hesitated before giving her an address, a quiet cafe on the edge of town. It wasn't far, and Sophie knew it would be a place where they could talk without interruption. After hanging up, Sophie spent the next hour mentally preparing herself for the meeting. She thought about Mark, about the man he had been when they were together. He had been charming, kind, funny, a man who could make her laugh even in the darkest of moments. But had she really known him? The thought made her stomach churn. She drove to the cafe with a heavy heart, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. The cafe was small, quaint, and quiet. It smelled like freshly brewed coffee and pastries, the kind of place where secrets were shared over mugs of steaming drinks. Clara was already sitting at a table by the window, her eyes scanning the room. When she saw Sophie, she waved her over. "Thank you for meeting me," Clara said as Sophie sat down, her expression serious. "I know this must be overwhelming, but there are things you don't know. Things you need to understand about what happened to Mark." Sophie's heart was racing. She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, tell me what's going on." Clara took a deep breath before she began. Mark's disappearance wasn't an accident. It wasn't some random tragedy. He was involved with some dangerous people, people who wanted him dead. "I know this because I worked with him, Sophie. I knew about the things he got mixed up in, things that went far beyond what you ever saw." Sophie's world tilted again, but this time, it was a different kind of disbelief. "Dangerous people? What are you talking about?" Clara nodded. "Mark didn't disappear on his own. He was forced into hiding, Sophie. He didn't just leave you behind. He was trying to protect you. But the longer he stayed away, the more it ate at him. He was trying to get back to you, but he couldn't risk you or Lily getting caught in the crossfire." Sophie's mind reeled. It was too much to process. She couldn't grasp it all. The man she had mourned. Had he really been running for his life this whole time? Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he contact me sooner? Sophie asked, her voice breaking. Clara's gaze softened with sympathy. "Because he didn't want to drag you into it. He thought the best thing he could do was stay away, let you live your life. But things have changed. The people he was running from are still after him. And now, after all these years, he needs your help." Sophie felt a cold knot in her chest. Help? She had spent so long resenting Mark for leaving, for abandoning her and Lily. Now, he was asking for her help, but could she trust him again? "I don't know if I can help him," Sophie whispered, more to herself than to Clara. "After everything he put us through, I don't know if I can forgive him." Clara's eyes softened with understanding. "I'm not asking you to forgive him right now, but if you want to help him, if you want to keep your family safe, you need to know what's at stake." Sophie sat in silence, the weight of Clara's words pressing down on her. She was torn, caught between the past and the future. She had always known that she couldn't escape Mark's memory, but now that he was back, everything felt like it was falling apart. She didn't know what her next step would be, but one thing was clear. This was far from over. Sophie barely slept that night. The conversation with Clara had been a turning point, but it had also opened a floodgate of new questions. How much danger was Mark in? How deep had he gotten into this mess? And most pressing of all, could she trust him again? The following afternoon, Sophie drove to the address Mark had given her. He had asked to meet her at a small, discreet location, away from prying eyes. The tension in the air was thick, and Sophie could feel her hands trembling on the steering wheel. This was it. She was about to face the man she had loved, the man she had thought was dead. When she arrived, Mark was already waiting for her outside a small house on the outskirts of town. He looked just as she remembered, tall, with messy brown hair and a scruff of a beard. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, Sophie felt as though time had rewound, that they were back to the way things had been before the world fell apart. But this wasn't the same Mark she had known. This man was older, more guarded. His face was etched with weariness, and the dark circles under his eyes told the story of sleepless nights and a life lived on the run. "Sophie," he said, his voice strained but warm, "I never wanted you to find out like this. I should have come back sooner, but I couldn't risk it." Sophie felt a rush of emotions, relief, anger, confusion. But the one thing that dominated was the undeniable ache in her heart. Mark was here, standing in front of her, and yet everything had changed. "Why, Mark?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why didn't you come back? Why didn't you contact me? We could have figured it out together." Mark's gaze dropped, shame flickering across his features. I didn't want to put you in danger, Sophie. The people I was running from, they wouldn't have stopped at anything. I thought I could protect you by staying away, but it didn't work. And now they're closer than ever. Sophie's heart clenched. So what now? Do I just pretend like everything is fine? That we can pick up where we left off? Mark stepped forward, his eyes pleading. No, I don't expect that. But I need your help, Sophie. We need to protect Lily. They'll come for her, too, if they know I'm back. You have to trust me. Tears welled in Sophie's eyes as she took a step back. Trust him? How could she? How could she trust a man who had disappeared from their lives without a word? But as she looked into his eyes, she saw the same love, the same desperation that had always been there. And for the first time in years, Sophie wondered if maybe, just maybe, she could believe in him again. But the danger was real. And with it, Sophie knew that everything was about to change. The days following their reunion felt like an endless whirlwind. Sophie's emotions were all over the place, caught between the memories of the man she had loved, the anger of his abandonment, and the fear of the danger that loomed over their family. Every time she looked at Mark, she was reminded of the years she had spent mourning him, the years she had raised Lily without him, alone in the quiet ache of his absence. Yet, now that he was here, standing before her, alive but so far removed from the man she had known, everything felt like a lie. Mark had come back, but with him, he had brought nothing but questions. Sophie tried to stay focused on protecting Lily, on keeping their lives as normal as possible. But each conversation with Mark only dug deeper into the chasm between them. His explanations, though filled with regret, only seemed to create more distance. How could she trust him again? How could she reconcile the man she had once known with the stranger he had become? Every time Mark tried to reach out to her, Sophie pulled away. She didn't want to feel the things he made her feel, the confusion, the hope that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild the life they once had. But that hope was fragile, like glass, and every time she looked at him, it shattered a little more. Lily, ever the innocent, hadn't yet understood the gravity of the situation. She didn't know why her mother was so distant, so cold towards Mark, but she noticed the tension, the unease that seemed to permeate the air whenever he was around. Sophie didn't want to burden Lily with the complexities of the past. She wanted to protect her from this storm that had suddenly reappeared in their lives, but that was becoming increasingly difficult. As the days passed, the tension between Sophie and Mark grew. Every conversation seemed to ignite more friction. Mark's insistence on explaining his disappearance, on justifying the choices he had made, only deepened the rift. He had been gone for 5 years, and now, as he stood in front of her, all Sophie could feel was the emptiness of those lost years. Why can't you just understand? Mark pleaded one evening, his voice raw with emotion. I did what I had to do to keep you safe, Sophie. I had no choice. If I stayed, they would have come for both of you. Sophie stood by the window, her back to him. And what about now, Mark? You've come back, but you're still putting us at risk. You're still a danger to Lily and me. I don't know if I can live with that. I don't know if I can live with you anymore. Mark took a step closer, his voice softening. I never wanted this for you. I wanted to come back for you both, but I couldn't. The people I was running from, they found me, Sophie. They won't stop until they get what they want. And I need you to trust me. I need you to help me protect you and Lily. Sophie turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let herself trust him again. But how could she? How could she let herself open up to the man who had hurt her so much? She couldn't just erase the years of pain, the loneliness. She couldn't just forget how he had left them, how she had carried the weight of everything on her shoulders, alone. I don't know if I can do this, Mark, she whispered, the tears threatening to spill over. I don't know if I can forgive you. Mark's face crumpled with the weight of her words. He had always been strong, had always carried a sense of control, but now, in front of her, he looked like a man lost, caught between the love he had for her and the danger that still shadowed his every move. I'm sorry, Sophie. I never wanted to hurt you, but I need you now. I need you to help me finish what I started. Sophie stood there in silence, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Was it possible to rebuild the trust that had been shattered? Could she really open herself to him again, knowing the risks, knowing that the man who stood before her was no longer the man she had loved? The answer, Sophie realized, wasn't something she could decide now. Not when everything was still so raw, so uncertain. But she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't keep living in this fractured world. Not for herself. Not for Lily. The first sign that the danger had escalated came late one evening when Sophie received an anonymous message on her phone. It was a simple text, one that chilled her to the core. "They're watching you." Sophie felt the blood drain from her face as she read the words. She had been trying to keep Lily's life as normal as possible, trying to shield her from the growing tension between herself and Mark. But now, it seemed that safety was no longer something she could guarantee. She immediately called Mark. He answered on the second ring, his voice tense. "What's wrong?" I got a message," Sophie stammered, the fear rising in her throat. "It said they're watching us." Mark's silence on the other end was deafening. "Are you sure? Who sent it?" "I don't know. But what does it mean, Mark? What's happening?" Sophie's heart raced, her thoughts spinning. She felt helpless, like she was standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to jump or turn back. "I don't know who sent it," Mark finally said, his voice low. "But I've been trying to keep them from finding you. They're getting closer, Sophie. I thought I could keep you safe, but I was wrong. They're coming for us. For you. For Lily." Sophie's breath hitched. "What do we do? What do you want me to do?" "Stay calm," Mark said, his tone hardening. "We need to get Lily out of here. We need to keep her safe, and we can't do it if we're exposed. I'm making arrangements. We're leaving tonight." Sophie's mind raced. It felt like everything was spiraling out of control. The woman who had once felt in control of her life was now standing on the edge, her world collapsing around her. She had tried so hard to protect Lily from this world of secrets, danger, and uncertainty. But now, it seemed there was no escape. "I'll pack a bag for Lily," Sophie said, her voice tight. "But Mark, what if it's too late? What if we're already too far gone?" "I won't let that happen," Mark replied firmly. "I'm not letting anyone take you from me again." As Sophie hung up the phone, a wave of dread washed over her. She glanced over at Lily, who was sitting on the couch, playing with her toys, blissfully unaware of the danger that was closing in. How could she explain any of this to her? How could she protect the one thing in her life that mattered more than anything else? She couldn't. Not alone. The fight for survival had begun, and Sophie knew she had no choice but to follow Mark, no matter how fractured their trust had become. Because the alternative was unthinkable. The stakes had never been higher. The night felt heavier than usual as Sophie packed a bag for Lily. Her hands trembled, the fear of the unknown clutching at her heart. The urgency in Mark's voice echoed in her mind, and yet, a part of her couldn't shake the deep-rooted doubt that lingered. Could she truly trust him? Could she really abandon everything she had worked so hard to rebuild over the years, just to run back into his arms, into a life full of danger? Lily, oblivious to the storm brewing around them, continued playing with her stuffed animals, humming softly as she lined them up on the couch. Sophie watched her for a moment, her heart aching with the weight of it all. Her daughter was so innocent, so full of light, and Sophie had worked so hard to protect that light from the darkness of their past. But now, it seemed that darkness was coming for them, no matter how much she tried to keep it away. "Mommy, are we going somewhere?" Lily asked, looking up at her with wide eyes. Sophie smiled weakly, sitting beside her. "Just a little trip, sweetie. We'll be back soon, I promise." Lily nodded, though her brow furrowed with confusion. "But why are we leaving at night? Where's Daddy?" Sophie froze for a moment. The mention of her late husband still tugged at her heart. She had told Lily that Daddy had gone away on a long trip, and she wasn't sure how to explain the complexities of their situation, not without shattering the fragile sense of security that Lily had built in her young mind. "Daddy is still away, sweetheart," Sophie murmured. "But we have to go to a safe place for a while, okay? It's just a little while." Lily's lips parted as if to ask more, but Sophie gently brushed her hair back from her face, offering a reassuring smile. I'll explain everything later, I promise. Right now, let's get ready for our little adventure. As Sophie helped Lily gather her things, she couldn't stop the knots in her stomach from tightening. The life she had known, the quiet routine she had carefully crafted for them, was slipping through her fingers. She couldn't change the past, couldn't undo Mark's disappearance, but she could protect her daughter. That was her only priority now. When they were ready, Mark arrived at the front door. He looked different than when she had first met him all those years ago. Older, wearier, but still the same man in so many ways. The sight of him made Sophie's heart ache, but it also filled her with fear. Could he really keep them safe? Could they survive this? Mark's eyes softened when he saw Lily, but his expression hardened again as he turned back to Sophie. We don't have much time, he said quietly, his gaze shifting nervously to the street outside. We need to leave now. Sophie nodded, her heart pounding. She grabbed Lily's hand, and they followed Mark out the door. The house that had once been their sanctuary now felt like a prison, and leaving it behind felt like walking away from the only home they had left. They got into the car, and Mark sped off into the night, the city's lights flickering in the rearview mirror. Sophie sat in the back with Lily, trying to appear calm, though her mind was racing with questions. Where were they going? Would they be safe? Could they ever return to normal again? The road stretched out ahead, dark and endless, and Sophie felt a cold shiver run down her spine. They were on the run, and there was no turning back. The past was catching up to them, and Sophie couldn't help but wonder what price they would have to pay for the truth. The drive felt like it lasted forever. The car's tires hummed on the asphalt, the world outside fading into nothingness as Sophie's mind churned with everything she had just learned. Mark's reappearance, the danger he had brought with him, the fact that they were now running from forces she couldn't even begin to comprehend. It was overwhelming. Lily had fallen asleep in the back seat, her small body curled up against Sophie. The soft sound of her breathing did little to calm Sophie's nerves. She kept her eyes on Mark's hands gripping the steering wheel, his jaw clenched as if he were fighting a battle of his own. Where are we going? Sophie finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror before returning to the road. I'm taking you to a safe house. It's off the grid, in the middle of nowhere. We'll be safe there for now. Sophie nodded, though the word safe didn't offer much comfort anymore. It felt like everything she had once believed about their lives had been turned upside down in a matter of days. The reality of their situation was settling in, and she knew there was no going back. They were in the midst of something far larger than herself or Mark, something far more dangerous than either of them could control. The silence in the car grew heavy as they continued to drive. The weight of their situation seemed to hang in the air, suffocating any attempt at normalcy. Sophie couldn't stop the questions from flooding her mind. What had Mark gotten himself into? Who was after them, and why? And most importantly, could she truly trust him again? I'm sorry, Sophie, Mark said, breaking the silence. His voice was softer than usual, filled with regret. I know this isn't the life you wanted. I know I've hurt you, and I hate myself for it. But I swear, I'm doing everything I can to protect you. I know I haven't been the man you thought I was, but I need you to trust me now. For Lily's sake. Sophie's throat tightened at the mention of their daughter. For Lily's sake. Those words felt like a lifeline, even if they were laced with the bitterness of betrayal. She had always believed that they could be a family again, but the person Mark had become in her absence wasn't someone she recognized. He was a man on the run, someone who had made decisions that had torn their family apart. I don't know if I can trust you anymore, Sophie said quietly, her eyes filling with tears. I don't know if I can forgive you for everything. Mark's eyes flicked toward her again, but this time, there was something in them, something raw and vulnerable, that made Sophie hesitate. She had always known that Mark loved her, but had his love ever been enough to keep them safe? Had it been enough to protect their family from the shadows of the past? I know, Mark replied, his voice hoarse. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Sophie. I'm just asking for a chance. For Lily. Sophie wiped a tear from her cheek, glancing down at Lily, still peacefully asleep in her arms. For Lily. That was the only reason she had to keep going, the only reason she had to believe in anything again. She couldn't undo the past, couldn't change the mistakes that had been made, but she could fight for a future, their future. "I'll do what I can," Sophie whispered, more to herself than to Mark. "But we have to be careful. We can't just run forever." Mark nodded, the resolve in his eyes returning. "I know, but we won't have to run forever. We'll fix this, Sophie. I swear." And with that, they continued into the night, driving toward an uncertain future. The safe house Mark had promised them turned out to be a small cabin tucked away in a secluded forest, far removed from any city or civilization. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind blew through the trees. It was quiet, eerily so, and Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that they were living in a false sense of security. As soon as they arrived, Mark insisted on making immediate preparations. He moved with urgency, securing the windows and doors, checking every corner of the cabin, as though someone could break in at any moment. Sophie watched him, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. She wanted to believe he was doing everything to protect them, but every action, every word, only deepened her doubts. Lily, oblivious to the tension, had settled into the cabin, trying to make the best of their new surroundings. She played with the few toys Sophie had brought along, her laughter a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere in the room. Sophie couldn't help but smile at her daughter's resilience, but the smile was quickly replaced by worry. The truth of their situation was becoming too much to bear. Sophie turned to Mark as he finished checking the perimeter. "What happens now, Mark? How long do we stay here?" Her voice was tight, but she couldn't keep the frustration from seeping through. "How long are we supposed to live like this, always looking over our shoulders?" Mark paused for a moment, his hand resting on the back of a chair. His face was grim, but he seemed lost in thought. "I don't know, Sophie, but I do know that it won't be forever. I'm working on a plan. I'm trying to get things sorted with the people I crossed. It's a dangerous game, but I have to play it." Sophie's heart sank. "You keep saying that, but it doesn't feel like you're playing a game. It feels like you're gambling with our lives." Mark stepped toward her, his gaze desperate. "I'm not gambling, Sophie. I'm fighting for our lives. For Lily's life. For you. I've made mistakes, I know that, but I'm trying to fix them. All I ask is that you trust me, just this once." Sophie stared at him, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. She wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe that the man who had once been her partner, her love, could still protect them. But the fear that had taken root in her heart couldn't be ignored. She had been alone for so long, had lived without him for 5 years. Could she really go back to depending on him now? Mark's voice softened. "I'm doing this for you, Sophie. I know I've failed you in the past, but I swear I won't fail you again." Sophie looked at him, her mind racing. The truth was, she didn't know what she wanted anymore. She didn't know if she could ever forgive him. She didn't know if she could go back to the life they once had, or if they even had a chance at that life again. But she couldn't afford to make decisions based on emotions alone. Not now. Not with Lily's safety at stake. "What do you need me to do?" Sophie asked, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. Mark exhaled sharply. "Stay here with Lily. Keep her safe. I'm going to confront the people I've been running from. It's the only way to end this." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. "No, Mark, you can't do this. It's too dangerous. We can't keep running from these people." Mark looked at her with a sad, resigned expression. "I don't have a choice. If I don't end it now, it will never stop. And I won't let them hurt you. I won't let them hurt Lily." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes. "I can't lose you again, Mark. I can't." "You won't lose me," he said firmly, stepping closer. "I promise. Just stay with Lily. Keep her safe." Sophie wanted to argue, to beg him to stay. But she knew deep down that this was something Mark had to do. He had carried the weight of this past for far too long, and it was clear that he wasn't going to back down. It was the only way to end the nightmare they had been living. As Mark turned to leave, Sophie's voice broke. "Be careful. Please." He stopped at the door and looked back at her, his expression softening for a moment. "I will. I love you, Sophie." Sophie's heart clenched as she watched him disappear into the night, leaving her alone with Lily. The fear in her chest intensified, but she couldn't show it. She had to be strong for her daughter. No matter what happened, she would protect her. The hours that followed felt like days. Sophie sat in the cabin, her eyes never leaving the door, listening for any sound that might signal Mark's return. But as the night wore on, an overwhelming sense of dread settled over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that Mark was in danger, that they were all in danger. The morning came too soon, bringing with it the unbearable silence that had lingered throughout the night. Sophie couldn't bring herself to sleep. She had stayed awake, waiting, listening, hoping for Mark's return. But as the hours passed and the light of day crept through the cabin's small windows, the reality began to sink in. He hadn't come back. Sophie's heart hammered in her chest as she picked up the phone, dialing Mark's number for the 100th time. It rang, and then it went straight to voicemail. Her pulse quickened, her mind spiraling into panic. Where was he? What had happened to him? Lily stirred from her sleep, rubbing her eyes as she sat up on the couch. Mommy, where's Daddy? Sophie swallowed hard, forcing a smile. Daddy's just taking care of some things, sweetie. He'll be back soon. But deep down, Sophie knew that wasn't true. Mark had promised he'd return, but he hadn't. And the longer he was gone, the more the fear gnawed at her, until it felt like an unbearable weight on her chest. Her phone buzzed suddenly, snapping her out of her thoughts. She looked down, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Mark's number on the screen. Mark! Sophie exclaimed as she answered, her voice trembling with relief. Sophie! Mark's voice came through, strained and weak. I'm sorry. I couldn't stop them. They're after me, Sophie. Sophie's heart sank. Mark, where are you? What's going on? I don't know how much longer I can keep running, Mark said, his voice crackling. But listen to me, Sophie. You need to get out of there. You need to take Lily and go. They know where you are. They're coming for you. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Mark, no. I can't. I can't lose you again. Please, come back to us. But there was no answer. Only the sound of static, followed by a loud crash. Then, silence. Sophie dropped the phone, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The worst fear she had ever known was becoming a reality. They were coming for them. And Mark was fighting a battle that he might not survive. Sophie knew what she had to do. She had to get out. She had to protect Lily, no matter what. She grabbed Lily's hand and led her to the door, ready to run. But as she opened it, she froze. Mark stood there, bloodied and bruised, his eyes wide with terror. Go, Sophie, he gasped. Get out of here. Sophie's heart swelled with relief and panic all at once. She couldn't believe he was standing there, alive, but she couldn't ignore the bloodstains on his clothes and the fear in his eyes. We don't have much time, he said, grabbing her arm. They're close. We need to go. Now. And with that, Sophie and Lily ran into the unknown, the future fragile and uncertain, but still worth fighting for. As Sophie and Lily ran through the dense forest, their hearts pounded in their chests, every step weighed down with the fears and anxieties that had plagued them. But in that moment, as they clung to each other, Sophie realized that life still held opportunities and paths to rebuild. Despite the dangers and darkness that surrounded them, love and sacrifice were the only light guiding their way forward. Mark, though exhausted and battered, was resolute in leading them. He was no longer the man who had left them 5 years ago. He was a father, a husband, carrying the responsibility of protecting his family from the shadows of the past. Each step he took was a promise to never let them suffer again. When they finally emerged from the forest into a safer place, Sophie looked into Mark's eyes and saw an unwavering determination. Though the enemies that pursued them had not given up, though the future held many challenges, she knew they had won the greatest battle, the battle to protect their family. Nothing was certain, but in that moment, as she watched Lily play in the yard of their new home and saw Mark standing beside her, Sophie understood that as long as they had each other, they could face anything. Because sometimes, the future isn't something you can clearly see, but something you build with small steps, love, and hope. And with that love, no matter what, they would never fall. Thank you so much for sticking with me through the entire journey of this story. Your support means the world, and I hope you enjoyed every twist and turn as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more exciting stories and content. Your feedback is always appreciated and helps me continue creating for you. Thank you again for your time and for being a part of this adventure. Until next time, stay tuned for more.